I want to tell you about a Sunday afternoon maybe 3 years ago. I was sitting in this chair, the one by the window, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I realized I hadn't spoken out loud to anyone in 4 days. Not a word. And the thing that surprised me wasn't that it had happened. It was that I hadn't noticed until just then. I sat with that for a while, and I remember thinking, when did quiet stop feeling like something was missing and start feeling like something I was actually protecting? I don't think I can answer that question with a date. It wasn't a decision. It was more like a slow adjustment, the way your eyes stop noticing a lamp in the corner after a few weeks, even though it's still there every night. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you live alone now, or you've lived alone for stretches of your life, and somewhere along the way, the ache of it softened into something more like ease. Or maybe you haven't lived alone at all, but you still feel like solitude is the place where you finally exhale, the quiet room inside yourself that you return to, even in a crowd. If that sounds familiar, I want to talk about that tonight. Not to fix it, not to explain it away, but because I think there's something worth understanding about what actually happens to a person who quietly gets used to being alone. Something most people never say out loud, because the people around them wouldn't quite get it. So stay with me for a little while. The first thing I want to say is that getting used to being alone is not the same as giving up on people. I think that gets confused a lot. People on the outside look at someone who has settled into solitude and they read it as defeat, like the person tried for connection, couldn't make it work, and learned to cope. And for some people, maybe that's part of the story. But it's rarely the whole story. What I've noticed, in myself and in people I've watched over the years, is that something else is happening. Something quieter and more deliberate. The nervous system, over time, stops bracing for an interruption that isn't coming. The mind stops reaching for voices that aren't there. And in that settling, something opens up. Psychologists sometimes describe this as habituation, the idea that the brain, when it's exposed to something repeatedly and without consequence, gradually stops marking it as a threat or a loss. The silence stops ringing. It just becomes the room you're in, but I think habituation is only part of it, because the people I'm describing didn't just stop missing noise. They started finding something in the quiet that they weren't looking for, something that now feels essential. I've met people, and I've been this person, who can spend an entire day alone and feel more themselves at the end of it than they did at the start. Not because they don't value other people, but because time alone is the place where they actually hear themselves think. And I want you to notice something about that. It's not withdrawal, it's calibration. There's something that happens to your relationship with your own emotions when you've spent a lot of time alone. When you don't have other people's reactions constantly bouncing back at you, you start having to sit with your own feelings more directly. You can't hand them off. You can't distract yourself with someone else's mood. You have to feel what you feel and then decide what to do with it. For a lot of people, that sounds like suffering, and early on it often is. The first years of real solitude, whether by circumstance or by choice, can be genuinely hard. Because without the noise of other people, your own thoughts get very loud, but over time, something shifts. Research in this area suggests that people who regularly spend time alone tend to develop a more stable relationship with their emotions, not because they're suppressing anything, but because they've had to practice sitting with discomfort without immediately reaching for relief. Think about what that means. You've been building something quietly every time you sat with an uncomfortable feeling instead of running from it. You were doing a kind of work that most people never do because they never have to. I didn't see it that way for a long time. I thought the discomfort meant something was wrong. Now I understand it was something being built. Here's one of the things I've observed that I find most interesting. People who have grown comfortable with solitude tend to become unusually good at noticing what's happening inside a room without being part of the noise. I think this develops because when you spend a lot of time in your own company, you stop needing social situations to give you stimulation. You come in already full, in a sense. So instead of performing or seeking, you can just watch. You pick up on the person at the table who's laughing too loud and then going quiet. You notice the shift in someone's energy when a certain topic comes up. You read the undertow beneath what people are saying. Most people miss these things because they're too busy participating. But when you've lived in quiet long enough, you learn to listen at a frequency that most people can't hear. Some people would call this emotional intelligence. I'd call it a side effect of solitude. When you don't need the room to give you anything, you can finally see what the room is actually doing. Maybe you've noticed this in yourself, that you sometimes understand what's happening in a group before anyone says it directly, that you can feel when something is off, even when everything looks fine on the surface. That's not a strange gift. That's observation, developed over years of quiet. Now I want to get to something that I think is the real heart of this, because there's a version of this story that sounds almost too comfortable. Like getting used to being alone is purely growth, nothing but gain. And I don't think that's entirely honest. There's also a cost. When you've been alone long enough and the quiet has become genuinely comfortable, you start building your days around it, and those structures, the rhythms, the routines, the particular piece of a Thursday evening when it's just you and the lamp and whatever you're reading, those become something you protect, sometimes without even realizing you're doing it. And then a person comes along, or a friendship deepens, or someone wants more of your time than you're used to giving, and you feel something complicated, not quite resistance, not quite fear, more like the awareness that letting someone in would require rearranging a life you've worked very hard, quietly, to build. I've felt that, more than once. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm saying it's real and worth naming. Because I think some people who have gotten comfortable with solitude mistake this protectiveness for peace. When actually, there are moments when it's closer to a wall than a window. There's a difference between choosing solitude because it genuinely feeds you and avoiding connection because connection has started to feel too costly, and that line is worth checking in on. Not constantly. You don't need to audit your choices every day. But every once in a while, it's worth sitting with the question, am I here because I genuinely need the quiet right now? Or am I here because the world stopped feeling worth the risk? Both are human, but only one of them is nourishing you. And this is where I want to offer the reframe. Because if you're someone who has quietly gotten used to being alone, and I mean truly gotten used to it, not just coped with it, then there is something I want you to understand about yourself. You adapted, not in a small way, in a genuinely remarkable way. You took a circumstance that the world often treats as a failure, living alone, preferring quiet, not needing a full social calendar to feel okay. And you built a whole interior life inside it. You learned how to be your own company. You learned how to feel your own feelings without running from them. You learned how to observe the world clearly without needing to be at the center of it. You built something real, even if nobody was watching. For a long time, I thought there was something quietly wrong with me because the quiet felt more comfortable than the noise, like I had somehow failed at the thing everyone else seemed to be doing naturally, like I was missing a gear. I don't think that anymore. I think some people are built for a life with more interior than exterior. And I think the world is so loud in its assumption that connection means crowds and happiness means noise, that people like us can spend years quietly convinced we're missing something. We're not missing anything. We're living differently, and living differently, thoughtfully, quietly, with intention, is not a consolation prize. It's a whole life. So here's where I land tonight. If you've gotten used to being alone, I think that deserves more credit than it usually gets. Not pity, not an intervention. Credit. You didn't just survive the quiet. You learned it. You let it shape you into someone who thinks more carefully, feels more clearly, and sees more honestly than most people ever do. That isn't the result of loneliness. That's the result of paying attention. And the question, the one I think is worth carrying with you, isn't whether you've gotten too comfortable being alone. It's whether the life you've built in the quiet is the life you actually want. If it is, protect it. If it's grown smaller than you'd like, let a little light in. But don't let anyone tell you the quiet is the problem. The quiet is where you found yourself. And that is not a small thing. Tell me in the comments, does this sound like you? The person who quietly got used to being alone and somewhere along the way stopped being sure if that was peace or just protection. I'd really like to hear from you. I'm Daniel. I'll see you next time.